In this video, we're going to be looking at the vastly improved Necromancer's toolkit in Season 4 with 15 new and useful things that minions are going to be able to do, and how one could utilize minions pretty much regardless of the Necromancer build that they're playing, and which sort of creates a really cool, in my opinion, Swiss Army knife or Summoner's Toolbox fantasy, where one can really take on the role or fantasy of the savvy summoner, flipping through the Book of the Dead to find the best combination of minions and abilities for any given situation. And without the first improvement to Necromancer minions, starting with the Skeletal Warrior, and this is actually going to be baseline for all types of Skeletal Warriors, and that's that they're now much more likely to run ahead of you and initiate a battle, which is a very welcome change to their AI, although there still is perhaps a little bit to optimize in terms of how smart they are. This is still a huge improvement over what it was previously, not only allowing you to deal more damage in general, but also allowing the Skeletal Warriors to soak up more damage for you. Next, and I'm pretty much going to be running through almost the entirety of the Book of the Dead because that's just how many significant changes there have been to the minions. Starting with the Skeletal Warriors here, where the Defender actually gained the ability to taunt enemies, and not to mention the second upgrade, by the way, will pretty much make them nigh invincible. And either upgrade that you pick, when coupled with the Needle Flare aspect, which now also worked, by the way, with minions, allowing your Thorns to essentially AoE enemies, I think we have something very interesting on our hands here. And onto the Reaper Skeleton, with the first upgrade they now gain the ability to reduce one of your active cooldowns by 3 seconds whenever they use their wind-up attack, which is a viable way for you to reduce one of your cooldowns, such as your Blood Mist or an ultimate ability, instead of relying on some of the traditional methods for these Infinimus or other types of builds. And next, onto the Shadow Mage, they now actually on baseline will pierce enemies with their Shadow Bolts, allowing for much more effective AoE with Skeletal Mages. And secondly, another upgrade that they got was, if you pick the first upgrade, you actually also get a damage buff to yourself for each active Shadow Mage. So even if you want to get more damage on yourself, you don't necessarily have to sacrifice your Skeletal Mages, and can instead opt to utilize the mages not only for their damage, but also buff your own damage with them, and have this extra source of shadow damage for whatever builds might benefit from that as well. And not to be left behind, the Cold Mages also saw some love, where their second upgrade will now, on demand, apply Vulnerable for 4 seconds, which is yet another way for you to easily apply Vulnerable, again, without having to rely on, say, Corpse Tendrils, or something like the Vampiric Curse aspect. And on to one of the coolest changes to mages in my opinion, and that's that Bone Mages with the first upgrade can now also cast Bone Splinters or Bone Spear, or at least it'll gain a 25% chance to cast one of these spells as long as they're on your skill bar. And while this may or may not be the most optimal way to play Bone Spear, it definitely is a ton of fun and is the primary build I am running on the PTR at the moment. And for a probably less cool change, but arguably still a pretty significant upgrade, again to the Bone Mage, instead of just fortifying you for a chunk after they die, which by the way, whenever they attack, they will sacrifice a bit of their health. But now instead of that, when they die, they do still give you a corpse. But now whenever they fire off an attack, they will also just fortify your life, creating a more smooth and perhaps on-demand way to gain Fortify. Which also, by the way, I think Fortify is sort of indirectly buffed in Season 4 because damage reduction in general is just harder to come by as an affix, which will make the 10% DR from Fortify probably a lot more valuable than before too. And now onto the Golem, and it's that baseline, they now actually also give you Unstoppable whenever you activate it, which will give you another valuable source of Unstoppable instead of, again, having to just rely on Blood Mist, right? Or you could even run both Blood Mist and Golem if you wanted to. But this change definitely makes Blood Mist a lot less mandatory as well. And onto the Bone Golem first, it actually gained the ability to, with this first upgrade, generate you 5 corpses on demand just by activating its ability, which is a really excellent source of corpses, of course for those builds that are heavily reliant upon them, right, such as Corpse Explosion builds, or say Black River with Corpse Explosion. And speaking of which, the baseline ability of the Bone Golem is to taunt enemies around it, while of course also making you unstoppable, as I mentioned before. And this definitely combos well with the second upgrade of the Bone Golem, which if we take a look, will actually allow the Bone Golem whenever it takes damage, or every 3 seconds when it takes damage, to deal not only AoE damage around it, but also makes enemies vulnerable for 4 seconds, again becoming yet another source of vulnerable on top of the aforementioned cold mages, and giving people more options beyond, say, relying on corpse tendrils. And onto the very intimidating looking Blood Golem. It may not have been the most popular golem, at least to my knowledge, but it's now also getting a pretty cool upgrade with its second ability, where whenever you activate its ability, not only will it deal AoE damage around it and heal itself, but it'll now also heal you, the caster. So not only will this give you an on-demand heal, which may or may not be super useful, but I found that you can actually also combo this with the aspect of Untimely Death, which was also updated to grant you increased critical strike damage whenever you are overhealed, and also based on the amount that you're overhealed by. So this could be a cool way to have an on-demand, especially if you have the aspects and ways to reduce the cooldown on Blood Golem to beef up your critical strike damage. And last but not least, the heavy-hitting Iron Golem also saw an upgrade, whereas with its previous iteration of its activatable, it would slam and stun enemies around it, but now it'll also pull in enemies as well. And now for some other effects that actually come from legendary aspects. First of all, we have the Blood Getters aspect, which causes your Skeletal Priest, which by the way, I would definitely consider another minion, to also empower you at around 55% to 70% effectiveness. So as a baseline, it would allow your skeletal minions to deal 30% increased damage, and now it'll just give you, the caster, a fraction of that whenever you cast it. And instead of being an offensive aspect, it is actually a utility aspect, so you're actually gaining damage by not having to sacrifice one of your important offensive slots on your gear. And finally, still on the topic of aspects, we've also got the new Aphotic aspect, which whenever you use your Skeletal Priest, will also empower your Skeletal Warriors to not only deal shadow damage, but allow them to stun enemies as well, which I would imagine could be pretty useful for tough content and pushing where survivability could be an issue. And I think it's also really cool that their hands kind of get this glowy effect. Really badass indeed. And again, this is in fact a utility aspect, which means you're not going to be taking up one of your offensive aspect slots for it. And with that, those are 15 ways that through minions, the Necromancer is becoming a heck of a lot more versatile and has gained more build diversity by way of incorporating minions. And I've also theory crafted a couple of builds for you that I'll link in the description box, the first of which is a Pure Summoner, and the second is a Bone Spear Minions build, where you can definitely perhaps swap out Bone Spear for another primary or core skill to use alongside some of these minions, as some of the concepts are quite similar, as well as the passive skills you'll be taking. Let me know what you think in the comment section below, whether I missed anything, the types of builds or ways you're going to be running minions in Season 4. And with that, thank you so much for watching, consider subscribing to my channel for more cutting edge guides, and I will catch you in the next one. Peace!